to go against Truman's orders and continually threatened to nuke the Chinese-North Korean border. So I don't think it would have been wise, really, to leave MacArthur in charge based on the way that he was acting, which is why Truman decides to fire him in the first place. Truman would have loved to have gotten rid of him sooner, but he didn't really have the grounds to do it. And really, Truman does it despite the fact that he knew it would be unpopular with the American public. But like I said, you have to remember he had the backing of Marshall and Bradley, two of the greatest military minds in U.S. history. If they didn't think it was necessary, they wouldn't have concurred with Truman. They would have said, no, leave him in charge. But the problem is, MacArthur had basically become more trouble than he was worth. It's not like leaving him in Korea, like I said, would have caused the war to go a different way than it already was going. No country in the UN at that point was ready to carry out a major offensive into the North again. They already saw how that ended. Plus, it was believed that any continued further escalating the conflict on the Korean Peninsula could have possibly brought in the Soviet Union on the side of the North and the Chinese, which, with Stalin still in power in the Soviet Union, was a possibility. You also have to remember, by this time, the Russians had the atomic bomb. So it was very possible that the world could have been plunged into World War III, and had it involved with nukes, had MacArthur decided to escalate the Korean War further, past April of 1951. So I don't think firing him was a mistake. I think it's that stance is something that he was able to perpetuate in the American, I don't know how to say this. He basically perpetuated the myth that it was a mistake because he was so popular with the public. And that goes back to basically his ability to control U.S. media coverage of him, dating all the way back to the beginning of the Second World War. If they hadn't decided to make Doug MacArthur a hero during his his last stand in the Philippines, I don't think people would have been as opposed to, MacArthur being fired in 51. I think a lot of it just has to do with his ability to control the U.S. Press. And with that, you can control what Americans thought about him, and a lot of it had been built on, not necessarily lies, but exaggerations. So, again, the short, not really answer because it wasn't a question, but my short retort to that is it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't necessarily the right decision, wasn't necessarily the wrong decision, but it was definitely justified, for sure. Now, would I have kept MacArthur, in charge in Korea? Personally, I don't know. I really don't know. If I was Truman in 1951, I probably would have done the same thing, to be honest, because he didn't have to worry about being reelected. If I was in that position, but I knew I was up for re-election in 52, I would probably avoid firing him because I knew what that would do to my career. But given Truman's situation, as much as I disagree with Truman and his whole handling of the Korean War, I probably would have made the same decision just based on MacArthur's actions, which aren't often covered in mainstream history. You don't really get that, the coverage of the Korean War in American history books in high schools and middle schools. You're basically taught that MacArthur gets fired because he wants to nuke, China and North Korea, which is not the reason why. There were, like I talked about in the second episode, there were plenty of different parties at the Department of Defense that were planning to use atomic bombs in the Korean War if the Chinese decided to escalate the air war. But it didn't happen. So to say that MacArthur was fired because he wanted to use atomic bombs is false. And to say that his firing was a mistake, I would also say is false. But it's also subjective. So, again, that's not really... I'm going off of what my understanding of the Korean War is. and your political stances are also going to play into it. If you believe that we should have gone to war with the Soviet Union in the 1950s, then you're going to say, yeah, firing him was a mistake. So, whatever. It happened. I don't think it was a mistake. That's the end of that. All right, on to question 4. This is... I'm going to read this word for word. I apologize ahead of time. This is a little bit crude, but quote unquote, why did he get pee-pee slapped so hard in the Philippines? Unquote. I cover that in the first episode at the end and a bit at the beginning of the episode. The reason he gets so messed up in the Philippines is basically he doesn't answer the phone for the first 6... Well, before we get there, let's backtrack. So, he was always going to lose in the Philippines. There is no situation in which the Japanese don't win in their invasion of the Philippines, unless they completely fumble the ball. They really... Even if the American forces had held out for another 4 months, it wouldn't have mattered. The Americans were so far from their supply lines. The Japanese were at pretty much the high water point of their power. And the American forces on the Philippines were so ill-equipped. The Filipino army was not on par with other armies at the time. It was mostly reserve forces using outdated American equipment that had been, some of the equipment they had been given was like pre-World War I stuff. And the American troops were also, operating with, used equipment that probably dated back to the Great War, if they were lucky. So, he was always going to lose. Just because, the cards were stacked against him in such a way. The Japanese had better equipment available to them. So it was and they were closer to their supply lines. There's a lot of factors. Like I said, I covered in the first episode. He was never going to stand a chance in the Philippines. But to explain why he gets pummeled so hard in the Philippines is basically, like I said, he doesn't answer the phone for 6 hours on the day of the attack. He basically just locks himself in his office and doesn't answer anything, any messages. He doesn't respond. It's not really... I've never been able to find an historical account that explains why he did that. It's kind of a mystery from my understanding. But this causes his Air Force to get completely destroyed while it's still on the ground. Planes are just out in the open, and it's really easy for the Japanese to take him out. It's more than half of his Air Force is destroyed within the first day of the Japanese invasion. So you eliminate air cover, and you're dealing with a nation that has, at the time, the Japanese Empire had a pretty powerful Air Force. They had a large amount of aircraft carriers. They had land-based aircraft that was able to hit the Philippines based from... I want to say based in Taiwan, they were able to hit the Philippines. Don't quote me on that. I don't have a map in front of me. I don't have all the information in front of me. I'm just going off of what I remember. But basically, if you want to be able to defend against the Japanese Empire in 1941, you need to have air power. Secondly, it was his decision to hold out on Bataan is another big reason as to why things go so poorly. The idea of holding out on Bataan in and of itself is not bad because the defense is able to hold out for 4 months. And it would have been a smart decision if there was a way for U.S. supplies to get to them within that 4-month period. But the U.S. had just been hit at Pearl Harbor. The Navy is it's not, totally knocked out of the game, but it is crippled. And the U.S. war machine is still needing time to be able to, gear up for war. So the fact that he decides that he's going to hold out on Bataan and wait for reinforcements was a fool's errand. They were never going to come, and I think he understood that. which is so odd to me as to why he then decides to do it, because he could have just as easily maneuvered his army south and escaped with as many forces as he could to Australia. He had that option. And he also misunderstood the Japanese invasions, like, full size. I don't know if I can't remember if I covered this in the first episode, but the Japanese invasion force that initially hits the Philippines is half the size of the force that MacArthur is in command of at the time of the initial invasion. So really, MacArthur could have repelled them. He could have met them in battle and repelled them. But again, it really wouldn't have mattered. So you could argue that then, yeah, technically moving to Bataan would have been the smarter decision because they were able to hold out for longer. But again, it doesn't really matter. Those guys either, if you ended up on the Bataan Peninsula, you either died or you were captured by the Japanese and were forced on the Bataan Death March, which I can't say which is better, to be honest. It's one of the most horrific incidents of, you know, Americans being captured in a war. I don't know, like the POW experience for the Bataan Death March is probably the worst case in American history. So it might have been better for you to die on that peninsula rather than being sent on that. So to defend his decision to go to Bataan it's hard for me to do, because he could have easily just escaped south, or maybe not. I might be, Monday morning quarterbacking here, but it would have been a smarter decision. Of course, like I said, we have the ability of hindsight now, but that's really the big reason, is that he pushes himself onto Bataan when he doesn't really need to, and it's only due to the hard-fighting American and Filipino forces and the iron will of those men that they were able to hold out for as long as they did. And like I said in one of the episodes, by the time that the fighting stops, they are literally out of food and ammo, and they lasted twice as long as anybody ever thought they would. So yeah, that's why he gets slapped so hard in the Philippines. The next question is also... I apologize for the wording of it, but again, I'm going to do it word for word. Quote, how many bitches he slain when he was spreading freedom, unquote. First of all, please do not refer to either of MacArthur's wives as bitches. I find it degrading. I find it degrading to call any woman a bitch, for the record. But to answer the question in the way that I think that you want it to be answered, he was married in 1922 to a woman named Louise Cromwell Brooks, and he divorces her 7 years later in 1929. He gets remarried in 1937 to a woman named Jean Faircloth. This is the woman that he will stay with the rest of his life. She was 18 years his junior, which is a little weird, but by 1937, Doug is like 57 years old and she's 39, so it's not that strange. And she ends up giving birth to his only son, Arthur, who happens to be still alive today. I can't find a single picture of him past 1951. Apparently he's this recluse who lives in has been living in different New York City hotels for the past 5 decades. So I've been able to find zero information on this guy. But I hope that answered your question to whoever asked it. All right. Next question. Why was his mom so weird? Now, I did cover this a little bit in the first episode when he gets promoted to Brigadier General. The whole reason that he gets promoted to Brigadier, if you'll remember, is because his mom writes a letter to General Blackjack Pershing, basically telling him that she doesn't want to die before her son becomes a general, and kind of guilt trips the guy into promoting him. But that's just kind of the iceberg with his mom, or the tip of the iceberg, I should say. She does a lot of different things in his life that are peculiar. She accompanies him to West Point. I think I covered that in the first episode. She would do this thing where any woman who he might have been interested in